Everything was on the line in this game between Magnus Carlsen and Sergei Karjakin. It was the 2016 FIDE World Championship, and the classical portion of the match had ended in a tie. So they go to tie breaks with a rapid time control, 15 minutes for each side, with 10 seconds of an increment to actually make their move. So they get a free 10 seconds before the clock starts ticking. This game was given to me by one of my viewers, and it really is a brilliant game. It ends spectacularly. And at the time this video is shot, Magnus and FIDE have kind of been battling each other. He even almost left FIDE altogether. Let's hope that never happens, because we don't want to lose Magnus playing in many of these top tournaments against the best players in the world. He has white in this game. Karjakin has black. He begins with e4. Karjakin responds with the Sicilian defense, c5. And after knight f3, d6, d4, cd4, knight d4, knight f6, the standard move for white here is to play knight to c3, and I'm sure that's what Karjakin expected Magnus to play. But he plays the second most common move, although not very common at all, f3, defending the e-pawn with the f-pawn. And the idea is he doesn't want to develop the knight to c3 and block this c-pawn. He wants that pawn to go to c4. So he protects e4 first with the pawn, so he can play c4 later. Karjakin plays e5, immediately disrupting the center and kicking this knight back. He does accept some central weaknesses, but later he would like to play d6, d5 and liquidate that weakness and hopefully have a nice center. Carlsen plays knight to b3, bishop to e7 from Karjakin, just developing his kingside pieces. And now Magnus plays c4. This was the point of playing f3. Now he has something of a bind here. There's no way the white's going to play d6, d5 anytime soon. The only downside is he does create a weakness in his own position at d4. Also, he blocks in his f1 bishop, and he has a lot of dark squared weaknesses in his position. So there's an upside and a downside to this c4 move. a5 is played by Karjakin. He wants to unsettle this b3 knight so the knight can go to c6 and d4. He doesn't have to worry about this knight taking it when it lands on d4. Bishop to e3 from Magnus, placing that bishop on a nice square, adding to the defense of d4. a4 is played. The knight retreats to c1. Castles, knight to c3, attacking the pawn at a4 twice. He could also go to d5 later. So queen to a5 from Karjakin, pins the knight and defends the a4 pawn. Queen to d2 interferes, so there's no longer a pin here. Knight to a6. This knight, obviously, usually you see the knight go to c6 here, but what Karjakin seems to want to do here is to play the knight to c5, then to e6, where it has options of going to f4 or d4. Bishop to e2, knight to c5. We see it continue on this potential journey of e6 and to f4 or d4. Magnus castles, and now bishop to d7. So black is in something of a bind here, but his main idea is to play on the queen side, at least at the moment, and maybe play rook f to b8 and try to arrange the b7, b5 move. But that's not that easy to do here. But he plays the bishop to d7. It can support this square. Also, it can go to c6 and help exchange off for a knight that lands on d5. Magnus plays rook to b1. He wants to gain some space on the queen side, and he's threatening b4, which it doesn't threaten to win a piece, but it does give him some mobility with his queenside pawns. Rook f to c8 from Karjakin, putting some pressure on c4. Magnus goes ahead and plays b4. Now that forks the queen and the knight, but that doesn't last because black can take that en passant, which he does. ab3, ab3. But now the threat of b4, forking the queen and the knight, is renewed. And Karjakin has to do something about that, so he plays the queen back to d8 so that this b4 move would not be a fork. Carlsen plays knight to d3, challenging that knight on c5, but the knight avoids exchange and continues his journey, goes to e6, can hop in again to f4 or d4. And here Magnus plays knight to b4. So we know how weak this d5 square is. In a perfect world, for Magnus, he would like to have a knight on d5 against a bishop at e7. If he could create that minor piece setup, he'd be in very good shape. bishop to c6 from Karjakin, helping to exchange off a knight if it lands on d5. Rook f to d1 for Magnus, putting some pressure down the d file. h5 from Karjakin. So his basic strategy here is to play on the dark squares on the king side. That's where he's trying to find play right now. So the idea is to play the pawn to h4, then to play knight h5, knight f4, and gain some dark squared pressure on the king side. Bishop to f1 from Magnus, anticipating that knight landing on this square. h4. Looks like he's continuing this idea here. Queen to f2. So with the queen backing up the bishop could go to b6 with tempo. The queen also, for the moment, puts some pressure on the pawn at h4. But here, instead of playing the move knight to h5, like we talked about, which seems to be a perfectly good move, instead, Karjakin plays knight to d7. So what's his idea here? He wants to trade off his dark squared bishop for white's dark squared bishop. He knows that white's dark squared bishop is a very strong piece, protecting a lot of weak dark squares, and his bishop at e7 is not good at all. So if he can exchange that off, it would be a real strategic victory for him. The knight goes to d7 to control b6. So now the threat of bishop g5 is very real, and Magnus needs to do something about it. But remember, this is a rapid game, so the time control makes the decision-making quite a bit more difficult. Here, Magnus plays g3. The idea is that if black plays bishop to g5, it looks like what he's thinking is he can play f4. Turns out, if that had happened, this would not work for white, because black could have taken on g3, take on f4, and here, Karjakin could have taken on f4 with his bishop. And the reason this works is after bishop takes, knight takes, queen takes, at the end of the line, Karjakin can play queen to b6 check, hitting the king and the knight on b4. So as it turns out, Karjakin could have played bishop to g5 here. But he does not do that. He instead plays rook to a3, putting pressure on the b3 pawn. Maybe the knight can come to c5, attacking it a second time. Here, Magnus plays bishop to h3, putting the bishop on its best diagonal. You know, it's hitting c4 here. It's not effective at g2, but on h3, it could exchange itself off for a knight. There's some x-ray pressure on the rook at c8, just putting the bishop on its best diagonal. Rook c to a8, doubling on the a file, and also moving out of the aim of that bishop. Knight to c2 for Magnus, hitting the rook at a3. He has to make a decision. He goes back to a6. The knight goes back to b4, and now rook to a5. Karjakin does not want to repeat moves. I don't know if Magnus would have repeated moves. He probably would not have, but Karjakin doesn't even bother with it. He goes to a5 this time. But now knight to c2, and there's still a threat here. What Carlsen is threatening is to play b3, b4, and then when he hits the rook with tempo, then plays b5. And would trap the bishop. So the threat of b4, b5, trapping this bishop, is very real, and Karjakin has to do something about it. Computers show us that the best way is probably to just play rook 5 to a6, and then after b4 to just play bishop to a4. And he could exchange off the bishop for a knight, and that would be the best approach for black. But Karjakin instead plays b6, allowing the bishop to tuck back at b7. Now rook to d2. Magnus just doubles on the d file. Queen to c7, adding an extra protector to d6. Rook b to d1. Bishop goes back to f8. And now Magnus takes on h4. Yes, that creates pawn weaknesses, but he's up a pawn. He's opened the g file. And this front h pawn could be used to open up lines, against black's king. Karjakin hops into f4. He's fine with white taking off that knight because it gets rid of the strong dark squared bishop. Bishop takes f4, ef4. But now, here's a very interesting moment strategically. Magnus goes ahead and takes the knight. So he's giving Karjakin the two-bishop advantage. But here, Magnus prefers his knights to black's bishops. After queen takes d7, knight to b4. We talked about how the perfect minor piece configuration for white is a knight on d5 versus this dark squared bishop. Well, at the moment, he's threatening to create that very situation. Karjakin counterattacks the pawn at b3. Magnus goes ahead and takes that bishop. Queen takes c6. Now the bishop pair is gone, and Magnus's knight can settle on b5, or d5, I should say, or b5 in this position. Now, he plays knight to b5, gaining a tempo against this rook. Now, the idea is that if black plays rook takes b3, then white has this fork. The best move probably is rook to a1, at least computers like it. But from a human perspective, this knight is so much stronger than that bishop at f8. I mean, Karjakin is just not going to allow that. He knows that in a position like that, Carlsen is probably going to win. And so he knows from a human perspective, he cannot allow that to happen. So what he did instead was he went ahead and took on b3 anyway. He gave up the exchange for a pawn, and he gets a pawn in return, but he doesn't have to worry about this powerful knight against this bishop. So he allows this fork. Queen takes c4, knight b3, queen b3. So black has a pawn, but he's given up a rook, and he has a bishop for a rook instead. Queen to e2. One thing white has to worry about, say, is a move like d5, then bishop c5 coming in and pinning. So first thing he does is step out of that particular threat, gets off the dark square. Bishop to e7, threatens the pawn. King to g2, so he defends f3 with his king so the queen can move away. And here, Karjakin could have taken the pawn at h4. I don't know why he did not do that, but he played the move queen to e6 instead, sort of centralizing. So Carlsen plays h5. He doesn't give black another chance. It also controls any checks on g6 for the time being. Rook to a3 from Karjakin. Perhaps he'll plant the rook at e3 with a tempo, but he's also putting constant pressure on f3. Rook to d3 offers the exchange. Rook to a2, notice the queen defends the rook. At the moment, it's pinning the queen, so Carlsen has to block it. Rook to a3, rook to d3. Now here, Karjakin does not go for the repetition because I'm sure he just knows Magnus isn't going to play into it. He knows Magnus isn't going to play the same move again. So he plays the rook back to a7. Now rook to d5 from Magnus, preparing to triple on the d file. The queen can move to d2, not only pressuring d6, but also threatening the f4 pawn. If black plays rook to a5 here, just queen to d2, and in this position, then white would just have a clear edge. So rook to c7 is played by Karjakin. On c5, the rook's a little bit better. It could, if he's taken, it could heal his pawns. But queen to d2, Magnus continues. Queen to f6, defends f4, but then Magnus has this nice move. Rook to f5, attacking the queen and the pawn at f4. The pawn is going to fall. The queen goes to h4. Now, it is perfectly acceptable. It's a perfectly good move for white to just go ahead and play queen to f4 here. Queen takes f4. But Magnus plays rook to c1, probably on the principle that he wants to reduce black's potential counterplay as much as possible, get a rook off of the board. And Karjakin does not want to do that, so he plays rook to a7. Now Magnus does go ahead and take that pawn at f4. Rook to a2 check, and king to h1. Now notice the queen at f4 defends h2, so there's no mate by queen to h2. But Karjakin does play queen to f2. And he is threatening queen to g2 mate. Karjakin is one move away from checkmate, but Carlsen was prepared here. He has a forced mate in this position. Now the first move he plays is rook to c8 check. Now if black blocks with the bishop, watch this long forced mate. Rook takes, check, king takes, rook takes f7 check, king to e8. Now, it looks like the king could probably run away, but Carlsen would have a mate with forced checks all the way. Rook to f8 check, king to d7, queen to f7 check, forcing king to c6. Rook to c8 check forces king to b5. Queen to c4 check forces king to a5. And rook to a8 would be checkmate. So he cannot block with bishop to f8. His only option is king to h7. So now, here's the challenge. do you see the best move for white? That's right. Here it comes. A rare world championship queen sacrifice. Queen to h6 check. Now, we call it a queen sacrifice, but it's a forced position. So black has to take the queen. And there are two ways for Karjakin to do that. He could take with his king, but then rook to h8 mate would follow. This is checkmate. The other option, though, is he can take with a pawn. But in that case, rook takes f7 would be mate. And because of that, after queen to h6, Sergei Karjakin resigned, and Magnus Carlsen remained the world champion in 2016. I hope you've enjoyed this beautiful game for Magnus Carlsen. Hopefully many more to come, fewer controversies, more great chess. Thank you for joining us at Chess Dog. See you again soon.